When Mike talked about the OSI model earlier, he would have talked about layer 2, the data link layer, which applies to things like MAC addresses. You know, the 48-bit hex address that uniquely identifies a network interface on a network. Well, there are a number of attacks that are based on this. In other words, they're called layer 2 attacks for that reason. And you can see why it was important that Mike explained to you what the OSI model was. If you don't know what layer 2 means, then layer 2 attacks means nothing. But you do know what it means. It's related to MAC addresses. So let's start by talking about a MAC address flooding attack. So we know what a MAC address is, kind of get a sense of what flooding means, but let's go into the details. With the MAC address flooding attack, what the attacker does is they send a whole bunch of forged, unique packets that have spoofed source MAC addresses to a switch to overwhelm it. Now, there are freely available tools that let you assemble and create fake packets, one of which is called hping. Now, what happens here in step 1 is we send all of that traffic with the forged or spoofed MAC addresses to the switch. Now, what the switch is going to do is it's going to start looking at its memory where it normally remembers the MAC address for every device plugged into a switch port, but that's going to be overwhelmed because we've got a flood of fake packets coming in, each with different MAC addresses. So when the switch becomes overwhelmed, it behaves like a hub does. And what that means is that it broadcasts all traffic to every single switch port. Normally on a switch, when you communicate with another device plugged into that same switch, there's a virtual circuit that's established and you both only see each other's traffic. You don't see any other traffic for conversations that are happening on that same switch. But this attack does allow you to see all traffic. And we know that the ability to see all network traffic is a big security problem. And so that's why a MAC address flooding attack is a security risk. A broadcast storm, otherwise called a switching loop, is similar in that we're talking about a flood of packets at OSI layer 2, the data link layer. It's related to MAC addresses. We're talking about excessive amounts of traffic on a network that can be caused by a faulty or failing switch. Sometimes even a failing network card will, what they call jabber. It jabbers on the network and sends out a bunch of useless traffic, slowing everyone down, almost like a traffic jam. Or we could have redundant network links between switches. It means switches have multiple connections to each other, which can cause a switching loop. Now that can be mitigated if you've configured Spanning Tree Protocol or STP on that switch. Let's talk about the broadcast storm in this sense. So in our diagram, we have 3 network switches labeled switch 1, switch 2, switch 3. And they're each linked to each other. So there's a network cable plugging the switches in together. But then if we add a redundant or a second path between switches 1 and 2, that's when you're going to start getting a broadcast storm. And what that will do is bring the network down to its knees so that there's no legitimate traffic that gets through. Or if it does, it'll take a very, very long time. So what can we do to mitigate layer 2 attacks? Well, one is to make sure we limit who gets on the network in the first place. We don't want malicious actors on our LAN. So we could do that with MAC address filtering to allow only certain devices on the network. But of course, take that with a grain of salt. MAC addresses can be forged, as we know. We can also use static MAC address assignments for each switch port. In other words, if I know that my laptop is going to be plugged into port 2 on the switch, I can configure the switch port to only allow connections from my MAC address. Again, MAC addresses can be spoofed, but this is still a good layer of security, among other things. We should always disable unused switch ports. If you've got a 12-port switch and only 10 devices are plugged in, disable the other 2. Don't wait until, well, I might need them next week. No, disable them. You can even physically lock them. You can get switch port blockers. It's a little, almost like a plug that you plug into the switch port with a key that you turn and it actually locks it. You can't take it out. That would prevent someone that has physical access to a wiring closet, let's say, from plugging in a cable. So that would be something else to consider to mitigate these types of attacks. Now, for broadcast storms and loops, we need to make sure, as we know, that Spanning Tree Protocol, STP, is enabled on our switching equipment. And we can even enable other options like Bridge Protocol Data Unit Guard, otherwise called BPDU Guard. So if you're not this network switch administrator, make sure you talk to those that are to make sure that these things have been put in place.